Gerald Ford, the 38th President of the United States of America, as well as the 40th Vice President under Nixon. I want to tell you something about his presidency and a bit about his life afterwards. Watergate Scandal. Ford gave a pardon to Nixon for the Watergate Scandal because he believed that protracted impeachment proceedings would keep the country mired in the Watergate Scandal and unable to address other problems facing it. Public reaction was very negative. Many believed that Ford made a deal with the former president Nixon to pardon him if he would resign. Ford still gave the pardon even though it may have cost him the election in 1976 because he thought that it was the right thing to do for the country. Other things Ford had to deal with at the beginning of his presidency. He inherited an administration plagued by a divisive war in Southeast Asia, rising inflation, and fears of energy shortages. He faced many difficult decisions, including replacing Nixon's staff with his own, restoring the credibility of the presidency, and dealing with a Congress increasingly assertive of its rights and powers. Domestic policy. Ford thought that he could contain inflation and unemployment by modest tax and spending cuts, deregulating industries, and decontrolling energy prices to stimulate production. This would also reduce the size and role of the federal government and help overcome the energy shortage. He summarized his philosophy by saying in a speech, "A government big enough to give us everything we want is a government big enough to take from us everything we have." The heavily Democratic Congress often disagreed with Ford, leading to numerous confrontations and his frequent use of the veto to control government spending. Through compromise, bills involving energy decontrol, tax cuts, deregulation of the railroad and securities industries, and the antitrust law reform were approved. Foreign policy. Ford and Secretary of State Kissinger continued the policy of detente with the Soviet Union and shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East. US-Soviet relations were marked by ongoing arms negotiations, the Helsinki Agreements on human rights principles, and East European national boundaries, trade negotiations, and the symbolic Apollo-Soyuz joint manned spaceflight. Personal diplomacy. The personal diplomacy of President Ford was highlighted by trips to Japan and China, a 10-day European tour, and the co-sponsorship of the first International Economic Summit meeting, as well as the reception of numerous foreign heads of state, many of whom came in observance of the US bicentennial in 1976. Aggression. With the fall of South Vietnam in 1975 as background, Congress and the President struggled repeatedly over presidential war powers, oversight of CIA and covert operations, military and aid appropriations, and the stationing of military personnel. On May 14, 1975, in a dramatic move, Ford ordered U.S. forces to retake the SS Mayaguez, an American merchant ship seized by Cambodian gunboats 2 days earlier in international waters. The vessel was recovered and all 39 crewmen saved. In the preparation and execution of the rescue, however, 41 Americans lost their lives. On 2 separate trips to California in September 1975, Ford was the target of assassination attempts. Both of the assailants were women, Lynette Squeaky Fromm and Sarah Jane Moore. End of his presidency. Ford fought off a strong challenge by Ronald Reagan to gain the Republican nomination. He chose Senator Robert Dole of Kansas as his running mate and succeeded in narrowing Democrat Jimmy Carter's large lead in the polls, but finally lost one of the closest elections in history. 3 televised candidate debates were vocal points of the campaign. After presidency. Upon returning to private life, The former president and his wife moved to California, where they built a new house in Rancho Mirage. President Ford's memoir, A Time to Hail, the autobiography of Gerald Ford, was published in 1979. After leaving office, President Ford continued to actively participate in the political progress and to speak out on important political issues. He lectured at hundreds of colleges and universities on such issues as congressional or White House relations, federal budget policies, and domestic and foreign policy issues. He attended the annual Public Policy Week conferences of the American Enterprise Institute and in 1982 established the AEI World Forum, which he hosted for many years in Vail, Beaver Creek, Colorado. This was an international gathering of former and current world leaders and business executives to discuss political and business policies impacting current issues. In 1981, the Gerald Ford Library in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and the Gerald Ford Museum in Grand Rapids, Michigan were dedicated. President Ford participated in conferences at either side dealing with such subjects as the Congress, the Presidency, and foreign policy, Soviet-American relations, German unification, the Atlantic Alliance, and the future of American foreign policy, national security requirements for the 90s, humor and the presidency, and the role of first ladies. As a former president, he got honored and awarded many times by many civic organizations. He also got many honorary Doctor of Law degrees from various public and private colleges and universities. His death. On December 26, 2006, at his home, Rancho Mirage, California, he died at the age of 93. After ceremonies in California, Washington, and Grand Rapids, he was buried on the ground of the Gerald Ford Presidential Museum in Grand Rapids. And with the end of his life, we are at the end of this video. Thanks for listening, and please don't judge my accent.